David Copperfield by Charles Dickens, Chapter 47, Martha. The neighborhood was a dreary one at that time, oppressive, sad, and solitary by night as any about London. There were neither wharves nor houses on the melancholy waste of road near the great black prison. A sluggish ditch deposited its mud at the prison walls. Coarse grass and rank weeds strangled over all marshy land in the vicinity. Carcasses of houses, inauspiciously begun and never finished, rotted away. As if she were a part of the refuse it had cast out and left to corruption and decay, the girl we had followed strayed down to the river's brink and stood in the midst of this night picture, lonely and still, looking at the water. I signed to Mr. Peggotty to remain where he was and emerged from their shade to speak to her. I think she was talking to herself. I am sure, although absorbed in gazing at the water, that her shawl was off her shoulders and that she was muffling her hands in it in an unsettled and bewildered way, more like the action of a sleepwalker than a waking person. I know, and never can forget that there was in her wild manner which gave me no assurance but that she would sink before my eyes until I had her arm within my grasp. At the same moment I said, "Martha!" She uttered a terrified scream and struggled with me with such strength that I doubt if I could have held her alone, but a stronger hand than mine was laid upon her, and when she raised her frightened eyes and saw whose it was, she made but one effort and dropped down between us. We carried her away from the water to where there were more dry stones, and there laid her down, crying and moaning. In a little while she sat among the stones, holding her wretched head with both her hands. "Oh, the river!" she cried passionately. "Oh, the river!" "Hush, hush," said I. "Calm yourself." I have never known what despair was except in the tone of those words. "I can't keep away from it. I can't forget it. It haunts me day and night. It's the only thing in the world that I am fit for, or that's fit for me. Oh, the dreadful river." The thought passed through my mind that in the face of my companion, as he looked upon her without speech or motion, I might have read his niece's history. A new burst of crying came upon her now, in which she once more hid her face among the stones and lay before us, a prostrate image of humiliation and ruin. "Martha!" said I then, leaning down, helping her to rise. She seemed to want to rise, as if with the intention of going away, but she was weak and leaned against a boat. "Do you know who this is who is with me?" she said faintly. "Yes." "Do you know that we have followed you a long way tonight?" She shook her head. She looked neither at him nor at me, but stood in a humble attitude, holding her bonnet and shawl in one hand, without appearing conscious of them, and pressing the other clenched against her forehead. "Are you composed enough," said I, "to speak on the subject which so interested you, I hope? Heaven may remember it, that snowy night." Her sobs broke out afresh, and she murmured some inarticulate thanks to me for not having driven her away from the door. "I want to say nothing for myself," she said after a few moments. "I am bad, I am lost, I have no hope at all. But tell him, sir," she had shrunk away from him, "if you don't feel hard to me to do it, that I never was in any way the cause of his misfortune." "It has never been attributed to you," I returned, earnestly responding to her earnestness. "Martha," said Mr. Peggotty, "God forbid as I should judge you, forbid as I am of all men should do that, my girl." His influence upon her was complete. She stood shrinkingly before him, as if she were afraid to meet his eyes, but her passionate sorrow was quite hushed and mute. "If you heard," said Mr. Peggotty, "aught of what passed between Master Davy and me the night when it snew so hard, you know as I have been, we're not, for to seek my dear niece, he repeated steadily, "for she's more dear to me now, Martha, than ever she was dear afore." She put her hands before her face, but otherwise remained quiet. According to our reckoning, he proceeded, Master Davy is here and mine. She is like one day to make her own poor solitary course to London. Help us all you can to find her, and may heaven reward you. She looked at him hastily, and for the first time, as if she were doubtful of what he had said. Will you trust me? She asked, in a low voice of astonishment. Full and free, said Mr. Peggotty. To speak to her, if I should ever find her, shelter her, if I have any shelter to divide with her, and then, without her knowledge, come to you and bring you to her, she asked hurriedly. We both replied together, Yes. She lifted up her eyes and solemnly declared that she would devote herself to this task fervently and faithfully, that she would never waver in it, never be diverted from it, never relinquish it, while there was any chance of hope. Under a dull lamp in the road, I wrote our two addresses on a leaf of my pocket-book, which I tore out and gave to her, and which she put in her poor bosom. I asked her where she lived herself. She said after a pause, in no place long, it was better not to know. Mr. Peggotty, suggesting to me in a whisper what had already occurred to myself, I took out my purse, but could not prevail upon her to accept any money, nor could I exact any promises from her that she would do so at another time. I could not do what I have promised for money, she replied. I could not take it if I was starving. To give me money would be to take away your trust, to take away that object that you have given me, to take away the only certain thing that saves me from the river. In the name of the great judge, said I, before whom you and all of us must stand at his dread time, dismiss that terrible idea. We can all do some good if we will. She repressed the tears that had begun to flow, and, putting out her trembling hand and touching Mr. Peggotty, as if there was some healing virtue in it, went away along the desolate road. It was midnight when I arrived at home. I had reached my own gate and was standing, listening for the deep bell of St. Paul's, the sound of which I thought had been borne toward me among the multitude of striking clocks, when I was rather surprised to see that the door of my aunt's cottage was open, and that a faint light in the entry was shining out across the road. Thinking that my aunt might have relapsed into one of her old alarms, and might be watching the progress of some imaginary conflagration in the distance, I went to speak to her. It was with very great surprise that I saw a man standing in her little garden. The moon was up now, though obscured, and I recognized the man, who I had once supposed to be a delusion of Mr. Dix, and had once encountered with my aunt in the streets of the city. The light in the passage was obscured for a moment, and my aunt came out. She was agitated, and told some money into his hand. I heard it clink. "What's the use of that?" he demanded. "I can spare no more," returned my aunt. He stood, moodily rattling the money and shaking his head, until at length he said, "Is this all you mean to give me, then?" "It is all I can give you," said my aunt. "You know I have had losses and am poorer than I used to be. Having got it, why do you give me the pain of looking at you for another moment and seeing what you have become?" "I have become shabby enough, if you mean that," he said. "I lead the life of an owl." "You stripped me of the greater part of all I ever had," said my aunt. "You closed my heart against the whole world. Years and years you treated me falsely, ungratefully, and cruelly. Go, and repent of it. Don't add new injuries to the long, long list of injuries you have done me." "Aye," he returned. "That's all very fine. Well, I must do the best I can for the present, I suppose." In spite of himself, he appeared abashed by my aunt's indignant tears, and came slouching out of the garden, taking 2 or 3 quick steps. As if I had just come up, I met him at the gate, and went in as he came out. We eyed one another narrowly in passing. "Aunt," said I hurriedly, "this man alarming you again. Let me speak to him. Who is he?" "Child," returned my aunt, taking my arm, "come in, and don't speak to me for 10 minutes. We sat down in her little parlour. My aunt retired behind the round green fan of former days, which was screwed on the back of a chair, and occasionally wiped her eyes for about a quarter of an hour. Then she came out and took a seat beside me. "Trot," said my aunt calmly, "it's my husband." Your husband? Aunt, I answered. I thought he had been dead. Dead to me, returned my aunt, but living. I sat in amazement. I left him, my aunt proceeded, laying her hand as usual on the back of mine. Generously, I may say, at this distance of time, Trot, that I left him generously. He had been so cruel to me that I might have effected a separation on easy terms for myself, but I did not. He soon made ducks and drakes of what I gave him, sank lower and lower, married another woman, I believe, because of an adventure. I believe became an adventurer, a gambler, and a cheat. What he is now, you see. But he was a fine-looking man when I married him, said my aunt, with an echo of her old pride and admiration in her tone, and I believed him. I was a fool, to be the soul of honor. She gave me a hand to squeeze and shook her head. He is nothing to me now, Trot, less than nothing, but sooner than have him punished for his offences, as he would be if he prowled about in this country, I give him more money than I can afford, at intervals, when he reappears, to go away. I was a fool when I married him, and I am so far an incurable fool on that subject. For the sake of what I once believed him to be, I wouldn't have even this shadow of my idle fancy hardly dealt with, for I was in earnest, Trot, if ever a woman was. My aunt dismissed the matter with a sigh and smoothed her dress. There, my dear, she said. Now you know the beginning, middle, and end, and all about it. We won't mention the subject to one another any more. Neither, of course, will you mention it to anybody else. This is my grumpy, frumpy story, and we'll keep it to ourselves, Trot. And that is the end of chapter 47.